Hello. The plan for today is to talk about strength and yoga. And I've had a little trouble organizing this discussion because there's so much to talk about. And I think that we won't be able to have the most super comprehensive discussion just in this one talk because there really is so much information. But my aim is to supplement your anatomy and physiology studies and your yoga teacher training, and particularly focus on a few things that can get a little bit muddy when we're first learning yoga anatomy and physiology because it's complex. But we are going to talk about a few topics. That includes some key definitions. The key mechanisms of strengthening we'll talk about. I want to talk about types of contractions because this is really important to yoga or any area where we're working on developing strength. We're going to talk about kind of how we might get stronger in yoga. We're definitely going to talk about the limitations of yoga for getting stronger. And I hope to offer some resources along the way and welcome your questions, your insights, and your wisdom as we go along. So let's first talk about those definitions. Let's talk about the definitions of strength, endurance, power, and stability. So what is strength? In general, it's the ability of a muscle or a group of muscles to exert force against resistance. And in yoga, strength is developed through exercises that ask us to lift or hold our body weight against the force of gravity. So those are movements like chaturanga, plank, boat, locust, powerful pose. And the aim here is that these techniques increase our muscle mass and increase our force production with repetition. Different from strength, we have power, and that's the ability to exert a force quickly. So we're combining strength with speed. And power is usually trained with more explosive type movements. So in the gym, that might look like jump squats or burpees. In the general Vinyasa Flow class, we do this less often. In traditional Ashtanga yoga, we do some movements like hopping or floating from the front to the back of the mat that do train for power, but much less so in the general yoga class. We have endurance, and this is the ability of our muscles to sustain repeated contractions or maintain a contraction for an extended period. And this is something we definitely work on developing in yoga. We can develop muscular endurance through more high repetition techniques like sun salutations, and then holding static positions like planks, warriors, arm balances. And finally, we have stability. And stability is the ability to control our joint position or our body position and transmit load. And in yoga, we develop stability with movements like our asymmetrical standing poses, certainly balancing poses, core strengthening poses. And these techniques all help us to improve stability and control of our posture and alignment. So those are some quick definitions when we're talking about strengthening. Let's talk about some key mechanisms of strengthening. So the first is overload. So you can think about it this way. Your body only gets stronger or more flexible or fitter by being asked to do something it can't quite do yet. By safely challenging or overloading your body beyond its current abilities, you're signaling that your body that it needs to rise to a higher level of performance. It triggers your body's natural processes to build strength or endurance or flexibility, right? Essentially, when you take your body just a little bit past its usual limit, your body responds by getting that little bit stronger. So that's overload, really important principle. Then we have progression, and this is always paired with overload. We want to make sure that overload is safe and effective by applying it in a gradual way. So this is progression. It's about slowly and systematically increasing the challenge as your body gets stronger. Too much too soon can cause strain, can cause injury, and then too little won't lead to improvement. And in yoga, as a student, by listening to your body, recognizing its current limits, you can get a sense of when it's time to increase intensity, right? Progression is really all about moving forward at a pace that's right for you. And I hope we'll have time to talk about this in a moment. Useful progressive overload can be really difficult in yoga because we've got all levels dropping classes. We've got people of all different levels of fitness, all different levels of experience, all coming to the same class. And it can be hard to take people on a systematic journey to progressively overload, right? And so all we can do as teachers is try to sequence in lots of options and talk to our students maybe about these concepts, maybe not in these terms necessarily, but about listening to their bodies and knowing when it's time to add challenge and when it's time to keep working at the level that they're at, right? This is particularly difficult when we're working in a place or teaching in a place where there's things like a 30-day challenge for new students. Because where's the progressive overload when we start at 100% and just keep adding, right? But I hope we'll talk about that in a moment. Next, I want to talk about adaptation. So this principle kind of explains how your body gets used to the challenges that you give it. So through progressive overload, your body adapts to the movements and to that kind of workload over time. So that's the movements in yoga, that's the length of time in a practice. And in yoga, when we're designing a sequence for students, it's important to balance a range of movements so that our students can adapt in a healthy way. As our bodies adapt to a specific practice, specific movements, specific intensity, specific time, it's really important to repeat that practice often enough for adaptation to happen. But if you stick with the same sequence for too long, your body may then stop progressing. And this is like hitting a plateau, right? So as teachers, we do need to mix things up occasionally to keep the body and our brain challenged. And I talk about this a lot throughout your course when I talk about balancing routine and variety, which supports healthy adaptation. So the challenges in yoga. We progressively overload by gradually increasing the difficulty, by adding more load, maybe changing angles, adding repetitions or the length of a hold to challenge our muscles. And this is easy to do when we're doing bicep curls with dumbbells. You start with a 10-pound dumbbell, you gradually add a few pounds at a time, right? This is not so easy to do with yoga. We have limited ability to reduce or increase the load we're working with, which is our body weight. If you think about a movement like chaturanga, what options do we have to reduce or increase the load in chaturanga, right? We can put our knees down or we can keep our knees up, right? Those are two of the basic options that we've got. So it can be really difficult to modify, and we'll talk a little bit more about what other options we have for a movement like chaturanga, but it's not so easy to add progression in yoga, right? Not as easy as it would be if we were using external weights like dumbbells, resistance bands, things like that. And we also, sun salutations aside, we often don't do a series of, 8 movements in a row or 8 repetitions of, a certain movement. So it can be more challenging when we look at yoga from a fitness perspective to progressively overload the way we might in a gym, right? And so for new students who don't have a regular movement practice, it's challenging the point that we may not be able to effectively apply an appropriate starting point for progressive overload in a general Vinyasa Flow class. But we can try, and we'll talk about that. I mean, think about a movement like downward facing dog. It's a lot for a beginner, right? We can adapt this by doing wall down dogs, chair down dogs, using hands and knees position, by using bent knees in down dog, adding blocks, reducing the time in the pose. But the difference in the challenge, in the load we're bearing between a wall down dog and a full floor down dog is significant. The overload is not really progressive, right? So that's one of the challenges that we face in yoga. Think about a movement like chaturanga. On the mat, you're either holding your entire body weight, or you put your knees down and you're holding 3/4 of your body weight. Like, what could we do to further adjust that movement to make it more accessible? Wall chaturangas, elevated chaturangas on chair or bricks, mini chaturangas, but it's not equal to the kind of progressive overload we could offer with other movement practices. And I think that's just something worth knowing. When we've got a beginner coming into class who doesn't have a regular strength practice, we need to take time to think about how we can apply progressive overload in yoga. And we've got tools. We can use props, we can use pose versions. We might need to do some creative planning. So planning for people getting up and moving to the wall, or some people in chairs and some people on the mat. But thinking about that ahead of time can allow us to better plan for all the needs that our students might have in the class. We could add some repetitions in particular places that gives people an opportunity to work on developing their strength. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And like with something like chaturanga, there are options. We just have to plan ahead. So for someone who doesn't have the strength and the stability to control their descent in chaturanga, we can add a bolster under their body. So they lower down onto the bolster. They work on controlling that top element of the pose, and then they can flow on in their sun salutations. We have to be prepared for that in advance and make sure students have bolsters and make sure we're queuing that option, right? So a lot of this is about planning in advance. When you're teaching all levels drop-in classes, you don't know who's coming to your class, so it can be hard to plan in advance. So, taking some time to really think about, okay, this is what I've sequenced for this class. What about people who've never done a chaturanga before? What about people who've never done a sun salutation before? What might I recommend they have next to them at their mats in terms of props, and what versions might I be offering for students, right? So those are some things to think about when it comes to really considering people's starting place in yoga and how we're going to safely, progressively help them build strength. Okay, let's move on and talk about types of muscular contractions, because this is really important in understanding where are we getting stronger in our yoga poses. So we have two main types of skeletal muscular contractions. First, we have isotonic contractions. These are contractions where we're moving, where the length of a muscle changes while we're contracting that muscle under load. And there's two isotonic contractions: concentric shortening and eccentric lengthening. So concentric shortening is when your muscle is shortening during the contraction, like your quadriceps or the front of your thighs when you push the ground away to stand up from powerful pose, right? And then we have eccentric lengthening contractions, and this is where the muscle is lengthening under tension. So an example of that is your triceps. When you're slowly lowering down from plank to chaturanga, the muscle is lengthening and contracting. So you're building strength by controlling your descent against gravity, right? And then we have isometric contraction. So this is where a muscle contracts against a fixed resistance. So where the length of the muscle does not change as we're contracting. The challenges in yoga is we only have so many options for concentric and eccentric contractions when we're working with our body weight, when we look globally at all the major muscle groups of the body. So think about, so go back to the bicep curl example. Say I'm doing a bicep curl with a dumbbell. When I'm lifting a weight, what kind of contraction is that? Concentric shortening. When I'm lowering a weight, it's eccentric lengthening. That muscle's lengthening under tension. When I hold the weight in space, that's an isometric contraction. We don't have all of those options for every muscle group in our general yoga practice. So we have the challenge of not having a lot of options for each kind of contraction with load against the force of gravity, right? Think about the tricep muscles. We've got this great technique, chaturanga, where we're doing an eccentric lengthening contraction, right? Under load, strengthening the tricep muscles. Where do we have a similar movement for biceps on the other side of the joint? Where's a technique in yoga where the biceps are under that much load, like almost our whole body weight? I mean, these biceps are still involved in these movements, but they're not the agonist. They're not the prime mover, right? Got like pulling movements. And it's not the same level of load, right? So in yoga, we've got lots of pushing movements and not a lot of pulling movements, right? So we don't have an equal opportunity to explore these different kinds of contractions under load in yoga. So that's one of the challenges. If you want yoga to be a place where we're doing comprehensive strengthening, and you might come to the understanding that we really can't do that completely comprehensive strengthening in yoga, but we can do lots of functional strengthening, right? And if we think about the types of contractions, think about, for our chest and triceps, we've got eccentric lengthening contractions, lowering from plank to chaturanga. If we want to use your advice, Kate, and do a couple of those, we've got a concentric shortening contraction, pushing back up from chaturanga to plank, if we want to do that kind of sequence. And then we've got an isometric contraction when we're holding chaturanga or when we're holding plank, right? Mm-hmm. So we do have the opportunity for the chest and triceps to explore all three types of contractions. Think about, your quadriceps. If we're in warrior one, we've got eccentric lengthening contraction when we're lowering down into warrior one on the front leg is what I'm thinking about. We've got concentric shortening contraction when we're pressing back up to standing. And we've got isometric when we're holding warrior one. If we wanted to play with those contractions, we could be easing in and out of warrior one a few times, right? So there's ways that we can play with these contractions a little bit. There are less options when we look at playing with the eccentric, concentric, and isometric contraction opportunities under the same level of load for the opposing muscles. And so that's just one of the complications of body weight based movement forms like yoga. Let's talk about how does strengthening work with yoga. So like many body weight based movement practices, in yoga, you're using your own body weight as resistance to build muscle, to build strength, to improve endurance, to improve overall fitness, right? To get stronger, we need resistance. And in yoga, that resistance comes from gravity, right? Our good friend. throughout life. The intensity of our movements can be adjusted somewhat in yoga by things like changing the position. So like knees down, by changing angle, by adapting a range of motion. All of those are going to impact load somewhat, but with those limitations that we talked about, right? Like we can't do a 10-pound chaturanga. That's really hard to do. And then say, okay, now this is a 20-pound chaturanga. We've got the options of wall chaturanga, countertop chaturanga, knees down floor chaturanga. Like we're limited. Yep, just talking about the limitations. Let's talk about the benefits. One of the benefits of yoga is that we are often engaging multiple muscle groups together. And that means that we're improving functional strength. We're improving the strength that we need to use in everyday life. Going from being on the floor to standing up, that's a really important movement to develop the strength, stability, mobility for, right? To improve our body control when we're standing on one leg. That's really important for everyday life. Even when we're doing things like walking, when you're walking, it's a practice of balancing on one leg and then balancing on the other leg, right? These are really important things that we're developing in yoga when we're using the full body. So I've talked about how, it's a bummer that we can't just like isolate a muscle group and say exactly how much weight we're lifting, but it's also a huge benefit to have a movement practice where we're using the whole body. We're strengthening many muscle groups at a time. And we're also improving things like rhythm and timing, like what muscle needs to contract when. We're developing coordination. We're developing our neuromuscular system. So our ability of our brain and our body to work together to coordinate our movements. These are all really important and help us not only in yoga, but, fitness, sport, everyday life, and active aging, which is really important. People know where they can go and do bicep curls with dumbbells or do, squat jumps and burpees. Like they know where they can go for that. They're choosing yoga for a reason. And we'll talk about this more in a moment, but I think it's up to every individual teacher what their teaching philosophy is, what their class is going to be composed of. And maybe it's just my bias coming from a fitness and movement background. I like that yoga gives us an opportunity to have a fairly comprehensive movement experience that helps us to develop a generally strong and mobile and flexible and stable body, right? There's gaps there for sure, but it does all of that in a completely different environment. It does all that with mindfulness. It does all that with self-love. It does all that without the no pain, no gain attitude, right? People are coming to yoga because they want to move, but they want to move in this way with this attitude, right? And with this community. So I think that that's worth remembering, that people are choosing to do yoga for a reason, right? And I wouldn't like my enthusiasm for strengthening to overshadow or overpower those other elements of yoga that people are coming for, right? I wouldn't like this is me. I wouldn't like my yoga class, even though I love getting stronger, to become a place where people are doing 25 chaturangas. At what point are we losing yoga, right? So that's something I think worth thinking about. While we talk about how can we get stronger in yoga, we also want to think about, do we care? Is this a place where I want to get stronger? Is this going to be the focus of my class? And those are choices that each teacher is going to be making for themselves. So how do we get stronger in yoga? A couple of keys that I think are worth thinking about, and this is going to come up when you're doing pose by pose studies. And I think it's worth thinking about when you're sequencing as well. These are some important things to remember when it comes to, am I strengthening in this yoga pose? Okay, here's the keys. Load. Am I lifting, and in yoga it's body weight. Am I lifting enough load to get stronger? Gravity. Am I working against gravity, right? Like, where's gravity in this equation, right? Your current strength. If you can already do a movement with ease, are you getting stronger? Is that overload, right? And then type of contraction, which we just talked about. So again, load. The load you're working with in yoga is your body weight. And as we've talked about, you can modify this somewhat by finding different angles, using props, using different pose versions, but your body weight is all the load you've got to work with, right? Gravity. In most cases, we are only getting stronger when we are lifting a load against the force of gravity or controlling a descent with gravity, right? So just contracting a muscle doesn't create more strength. And we'll talk about this in a moment, but consider the difference between three very similar poses. Picture in your mind standing forward fold, seated forward fold, and our standing or extended hand to big toe pose, the big balance where we're standing and we lift one leg and catch the toe. Those are all basically the same movement. Well, one's asymmetrical, but are all of those movements getting us stronger in the same way, in the same places? So if you're already capable of a movement, so load plus gravity, you aren't getting stronger when you do it. It might be helping you maintain your strength, and it might be a beautiful mindfulness practice. But remember the principle of overload. You're not getting stronger by doing things you can already do, right? And again, how much are we able to add strengthening to yoga movements once we're able to do them all? And are we willing to sacrifice what is yoga about yoga to get that strengthening? And you might say, no, I'm not. I need to go get more strength somewhere else if that's my goal. If you're teaching, yoga, well, that's a branded thing, but like a fit yoga class or yoga and fitness kind of class, great. That's what your students are signing up for. But if your students are signing up for, mindful yoga practice, then that might not be the place to do 25 repetitions of chaturanga, right? When we're talking about yoga as being a practice of self-knowledge, a practice of meditation, a practice of union of body, mind, and breath, then it might not be a place for that. So if you want to do that, awesome. You just have to tell people that's what it is. The thing about, I just talked about this in another recent coaching session. Humans, this is, Heather's random theory number 46. We have a tendency to always take things too far as human beings. We have a tendency to always make things weird. We take this beautiful practice and we go, how can I make this more extreme? How could I do this more? And that's great. We're always testing the limits. We're always challenging, our abilities. But again, there's a point at which we're crossing a boundary between what is yoga and what is fitness. And it's up to you as a teacher and to be clear with your students about where your class is going to fit on the spectrum of yoga and fitness, right? And it can be a sneaky slide. I remember a graduate of core yoga was taking over a class from another teacher. And if you're familiar with Pilates, it's a technique called hundreds, and you do 100 of them. And she's teaching this class, and the students all speak up, like, really proudly, we don't do hundreds, we do 500s. It's like, okay. Need to take that movement to that extreme. Like, it's beneficial in this quantity, and beyond that quantity, are you still getting the mind body benefits of the practice when you have to take every movement to the maximum? Okay? And so those are questions I think are worthy of asking yourself, and maybe asking yourself on a regular basis, because we can get distracted by shiny things and start to fall into sequencing and teaching habits that might not be congruent with our real teaching philosophy, right? Especially if you're teaching in a place like a gym or a studio where there's a real attitude about more and more and more. Okay? So those are some things to think about. Yeah. Okay, let's look at those 3 different poses that I mentioned that have the same key movement, and look at what's getting stronger, if anything, right? So standing forward fold, seated forward fold, and extended hand to big toe pose, or big standing balance. They all have the same key movement, which is hip flexion, but we're not getting stronger in the same ways, in the same places in each of those movements. So I'm going to have to ask you to use your imagination here. Or if you're listening to the recording and you're in your body on a mat, you can do the poses. Let's think about standing forward fold. So the key movement is hip flexion. So we're folding forward at our hips. We're standing, our upper body is folding forward. So what's the load in this movement? It's our upper body, which in this orientation to gravity is moderately heavy, depending on the size of your body, the length of your torso, etc. What's our relationship to gravity? We're moving into gravity, right? We're not fighting against gravity, we're moving into gravity. What's the type of contraction? It's an eccentric lengthening contraction of the glutes and hamstrings. So what's stopping us as we start to tip forward, what's stopping us from just falling is at the back of the body, our glutes and hamstrings are contracting and lengthening to control our movement into gravity, into our forward fold. Okay? When we come out of the pose, concentric shortening contraction to come up. So what's getting stronger? Your glutes and hamstrings, some of the postural muscles of your back, while they contract to lower your upper body down under control. So is this a pose where when we're first introduced to it, we get stronger? Yes. If we are not already adapted to this type of movement, yes. But for how long do you think it's going to take to progressively overload until we've adapted to this movement? We're no longer getting stronger from it. Pretty quickly, right? It's not a huge amount of load. Let's talk about seated forward fold. So imagine yourself sitting, legs extended. The key movement, again, is hip flexion. The load is your upper body, but in this orientation, that load is very light, right? Our relationship to gravity, we're moving into gravity. The type of contraction is a concentric shortening contraction of your hip flexors and your abdominals to pull you into the movement. So it's the exact same movement, but what pulls us into the fold is at the front of the body, the hip flexors and abdominals, concentric shortening contraction to draw us forward so we can catch our feet. And the only load they're bearing is that little bit of gravity in the upper body, and then the counter pull of your glutes and hamstrings, right? So basically the same movement, very different when it in terms of what's in charge of the movement and whether or not we're getting stronger. So even if you're new to yoga and you have tight hamstrings and glutes, are you getting stronger, or would this be a place to build significant strength in your yoga practice? No. This isn't a pose where we're focused on strengthening. Yeah. Let's look at the third pose I talked about, extended hand to big toe pose, Utthita Padangusthasana. So standing balance, you're standing on 2 feet, you lift one leg, catch your big toe. Again, the key movement is hip flexion, right? What's the load? Your leg. Legs are heavy. So this is a heavier load, right? Our relationship to gravity, we're moving that leg against gravity. And the type of contraction. So this is a concentric shortening contraction of the hip flexors, right? So again, same movement, but what pulls us into the balance is the hip flexors. The load they're bearing is the weight of a whole leg against gravity, as well as the counter pull of hamstrings and glutes. So lots of strengthening here, plus all the stabilizers that are holding you in place. So you've got the standing leg, glutes, hamstrings, quadriceps, your core is working, your back's working, right? So this is a place where we would be developing significant strength. And when we think about that, we think, so new students who maybe haven't built up that strength are going to need options moving into this, right? They might not lift their whole leg, so big load against gravity the first time out. They might cut that load in half by bending the knee. They might cut that load even more by not lifting the leg quite so high against gravity, right? So this gives us a chance to really start thinking about, from a strength perspective, flexibility is a whole other topic. From a strength perspective, starting to anticipate what our students might need from us, right? Given their starting position. And again, I understand that is a challenge when we're teaching those all levels drop-in classes where we could have very experienced practitioners next to people who've never done yoga before. And then we could have elite athletes next to someone who is just getting back to a movement practice after a period of no movement, right? So we have to be planning in advance and thinking about how we might structure a class and what supports we might be offering our students. I think that isometrics are a great way to introduce people to new loads, to new joint positions, to new movements. So for instance, instead of going straight to a sidearm balance from a plank, you might spend a few weeks just transferring body weight from one hand to the other, but staying in plank or a modified plank, right? To give people the opportunity to develop some of the strength, endurance, stability, and control they're going to need to be able to do those bigger movements. I think one of the challenges that we face as yoga teachers is getting out of our own bodies, is remembering that our students may not have our level of fitness. They may not have our level of strength. They almost certainly don't have our level of experience with yoga, and therefore haven't worked out the rhythm, the timing, the coordination, the control, the stability, right? So to regularly get out of your own body and think about, what are the bodies coming to my class like? Can they stand on one leg with another leg fully straight out? And if not, what am I going to offer, right? It can be hard to remember that your students' bodies are not your body, right? Especially for people like me who are hypermobile. It took me a long time to work out that people just were not going to be able to do what I can do. And I really needed to rewind technique significantly from where I thought people's starting place was. I love these days in yoga where we're talking so much more about accessibility, about adaptation. When I first studied yoga, there wasn't such a thing as accessibility. There was the pose. Do it. Do it. That was it. So now we live in this wonderful time where we've got so many bus stops. We've got so many opportunities to experience a pose in the body you're in today, with the hope that over time we will progressively overload and build strength, mobility, flexibility, stability, right? But we do have to get out of our own bodies in order to recognize where our students are starting from. If you want your yoga class to be a place where people are getting stronger, I like yoga to be a place where people are getting physically stronger and mentally stronger and feeling more confident in their bodies and more confident in moving their bodies. That's a goal for me as a teacher. That's part of my teaching philosophy. So as you've seen in the sequences I developed, there's lots of opportunities for strengthening. Upper body strengthening, plank, chaturanga, arm balances, which are strengthening, chest, upper back, biceps, triceps. Lower body, warriors, powerful poses, extended hand to big toe pose, right? Asymmetrical standing poses, focusing on leg strength, glute strength, and all our stabilizing muscles, right? Core and back strength, boat pose, plank, locust, right? Helping us to stabilize our spine and our trunk. So if we want yoga to be a place where people are getting physically stronger and also developing more confidence in their strength, which I think is important, those are movements to be including in your yoga practice. I do have lots of little techniques that I like to employ in classes that are oriented around developing your practice. So often those are level 1-2 classes where students are working on developing their practice. I have lots of little exercises that we use to develop the strength. And they're often just like the first part of a movement, or like I said, from plank, starting to transition your way, or 3-2-1 chaturanga, where you're going down 3-2-1 to work on developing strength at all of those angles. So like some of those are in your virtual yoga studio drive. There's some audio practices in the shop. If you go to the website at yogatrinity.com and go to the shop and just click on the free category, there's a bunch of audio, short little movement podcasts with lots of those little exercises in them that just give people that little bit of an opportunity to play with something more or play on the way to a new technique. And so again, those are really, I use this a lot in classes where people are wanting to develop their physical practice, as opposed to classes that are more oriented around rest or meditation or ease. Yoga does give us the opportunity to develop our bodies. Like we think about, in the transition from the back of the mat to the front of the mat, we start by leaning on one leg and stepping and leaning on that leg and stepping. And then we learn to keep more weight in our arms and walk the feet forward and then jog the feet forward and then hop the feet forward and then float to a handstand and then tuck our feet into the standing forward fold. So we have opportunities in yoga to progressively overload, to build strength and coordination and stability. Again, one of the big challenges that we face is those all levels drop-in classes. It's harder to take people on a systematic journey, but we do the best that we can in that environment.
We had a few technical difficulties, but I'm back and it's time to wrap up this discussion. So, in closing, yoga does offer us opportunities to build muscular strength and endurance, to develop coordination and stability and stamina. But yoga has limited opportunities to adjust load and not enough opportunities to build strength in every muscle group. Like we have more pushing than pulling movements, for example. If yoga is going to be our primary movement practice, we might think about getting creative about the strengthening movements in our practice. But to me, I think it's a good idea to have a movement practice outside of yoga that's dedicated to building strength. So lifting weights, for example, so that yoga can stay yoga and not become totally oriented around fitness benefits. and can remain a practice of self-knowledge and meditation and moving into stillness, with all the general health benefits that that entails. But those are just my thoughts. Let me give you some resources. If you're excited about anatomy and you want to continue to explore the anatomy and physiology of yoga, a couple of books I can recommend. The Key Muscles of Yoga by Ray Long. There's a whole big series. The Anatomy Coloring Book. Yoga Anatomy by Amy Matthews and Leslie Kaminoff. Functional Anatomy of Yoga by David Keel, Anatomy of Yoga by Paul Grilly. These are all great books and or DVD series. If you're keen to learn more about finding strengthening opportunities within a yoga class, follow some of these great innovators. Catherine Bruni-Young of Mindful Strength, Trina Altman, Jules Mitchell, Jenny Rawlings. These are all people that you can find on social media or follow their blogs and websites and podcasts. Okay, that's all from me today. Thanks so much for joining me for a bit of an explore into how we might strengthen our bodies in yoga. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and I look forward to seeing y'all next week. Thank you.